What was night like in a world without electric light, without clocks, and without silence as we know it today? For most Romans, sleep did not arrive at a fixed hour, and night did not mean complete stillness. It unfolded slowly, shaped by darkness, habit, and the quiet presence of other people nearby. In ancient Roman towns, the night was not something to escape from, it was simply another part of the daily rhythm. Streets grew darker, lamps were lit sparingly, and activity softened rather than stopping. People adjusted to night the same way they adjusted to daylight, without urgency and without expectation. Sleep itself was not a single, uninterrupted event. It was flexible, sometimes light, sometimes deep, and often shared. Waking during the night was common and unremarkable. Rest was shaped by the environment rather than controlled by schedules or devices. Tonight, we will spend time inside that quieter half of the Roman day. There is nothing you need to follow closely and nothing you need to remember. The details can pass gently one after another, forming a calm picture of how people rested in a world guided by darkness and routine. We will move slowly through evening, night, and the early hours before morning. The pace will remain steady, and the focus will stay on what was ordinary and familiar. If your attention drifts, that is perfectly fine. The night will continue quietly in the background. Night in the Roman world did not begin at a precise hour. There was no single moment that everyone recognized as the official end of the day. Instead, night arrived gradually, settling in as daylight weakened and daily activity slowly withdrew. For Romans, sunset was not a sharp signal but a process. Light changed first in quality rather than brightness. It became softer, lower, and less direct. Shadows stretched across walls, streets, and courtyards. Details that had been cleared during the day began to blur. These changes were noticed instinctively, without calculation or comment. In Roman towns, the built environment shaped how evening unfolded. Stone buildings retained warmth from the day, while narrow streets filled with shadow earlier than open spaces. Some areas slipped into dimness long before others. The town transformed unevenly, section by section, rather than all at once. People did not think in terms of evening hours. Instead, they sensed that certain activities were becoming harder to continue. Tasks requiring precision were the first to fade. Movement slowed, attention shifted away from producing or building and toward maintaining what already existed. Tools were set aside not by rule, but because continuing no longer felt practical. Within households, the approach of night did not bring dramatic changes. There was no formal evening routine. People simply began spending more time indoors or in sheltered courtyards. Doors were adjusted to manage airflow. Openings were narrowed or widened depending on temperature and remaining light. For those who worked outdoors, evening created natural limits. Not because work was forbidden, but because it became inefficient. Eyes tired more quickly, and mistakes became more likely. Activity decreased naturally without instruction or enforcement. In provincial towns, this transition was especially calm. There was no public lighting meant to extend the day. Without strong artificial light, people accepted the boundaries set by nature. The day ended when it became easier to stop than to continue. Seasonal changes strongly influenced how night was experienced. In summer, light lingered longer and activity stretched naturally into the evening. People remained outside, taking advantage of cooler air. In winter, darkness arrived earlier, and retreat into sheltered spaces happened sooner. This seasonal variation did not create anxiety or confusion. There was no expectation that days should follow a fixed length. Habits adjusted automatically. Bodies and routines adapted without conscious effort because there was no artificial alternative. For Romans, night was not an abstract concept, it was a physical condition felt through temperature, light, and sound. As the sky darkened, the soundscape of the town shifted. Sharp daytime noises faded, replaced by fewer, lower sounds. Footsteps became less frequent. Voices softened and thinned out. There was no idea of staying up late as a deliberate choice. People did not resist night. They moved with it. Activity reorganized itself around what could still be done comfortably in low light. In many households, evening brought people closer together in shared spaces. Not for focused conversation, but because lit areas were limited. A single lamp created a natural center. People gravitated toward light without planning to do so. Night did not begin with a symbolic gesture. It arrived through a collection of small adjustments. A door closed, a lamp lit, a task postponed. Each action was ordinary, but together they marked the transition from one phase of the day to another. In larger towns, night brought a sense of collective withdrawal. Streets grew quieter, though not empty. Movement continued, but at a reduced pace. The presence of others was suggested rather than clearly seen. In rural areas, night arrived even more directly. Open landscapes darkened quickly. Roads and fields disappeared into shadow. There, evening meant a clear retreat into the home or shelter. Across all settings, night was not experienced as an interruption of life, but as a shift in rhythm. Activity did not vanish, it narrowed and softened. This gradual change prepared the body for rest without forcing it. For Romans, the fact that night began differently each day was not a problem. There was no standard to compare against. Each evening was accepted as it came, reducing anticipation and tension. Night was neither eagerly awaited nor avoided. It was part of the daily cycle, a phase in which energy withdrew naturally and attention softened without effort. In this way, night in the Roman world was not a fixed moment, but a state that settled in slowly. It was recognized not by clocks or signals, but by the sense that the day no longer needed to continue. This slow, unhurried transition created the conditions for sleep without planning. Night made space for itself, and people followed without resistance. After sunset, a Roman town did not fall silent all at once. Instead, it entered a different state of activity. The energy of the day did not disappear, but it softened. Movement became slower, sounds grew more spaced out, and the town began to feel contained rather than expansive. Streets that had been busy earlier did not empty immediately. People were still present, but fewer of them moved at the same time. Footsteps echoed more clearly against stone surfaces. Voices carried farther, even when spoken quietly. Each sound stood out because there were fewer sounds overall. The absence of strong artificial lighting shaped how the city was experienced. Without street lamps or illuminated buildings, visibility dropped quickly. People relied on memory rather than sight to navigate familiar paths. Corners, doorways, and changes in elevation were known by habit. Walking at night required attention but not anxiety. Most movement after sunset was purposeful. People did not wander aimlessly through the town. Travel was limited to what was necessary: a short walk home, a visit to a nearby household, a final task completed before full darkness settled in. Distance mattered more at night because every step required awareness. Shops and workshops closed gradually. There was no official closing time. Doors were shut when light faded enough to make work impractical. Some remained open longer in summer, while others closed earlier in winter. The rhythm depended on light, season, and custom rather than regulation. As commercial activity slowed, the character of the streets changed. The sounds of tools and trade were replaced by quieter noises, containers being moved, doors closing, fabric brushing against stone. These were not loud sounds, but they marked the transition from production to rest. Animals contributed to the nighttime atmosphere. Donkeys, dogs, and other domestic animals remained present within the town. Their movements were familiar and expected. A dog barking once or twice did not signal danger. It signaled normality. Animals were part of the nighttime environment, not intruders within it. Public spaces took on a different role after sunset. During the day, they were places of exchange and movement. At night, they became quieter passages rather than destinations. People crossed them rather than gathered within them. The focus shifted inward, toward private or semi-private spaces. The lack of illumination meant that shadows dominated the visual field. Walls, columns, and overhangs blended into one another. The edges of buildings softened. This visual simplicity reduced stimulation. The environment offered fewer details for the eye to process. Sound became the primary source of information. People listened more closely. The rhythm of footsteps, the direction of voices, and the presence of animals helped orient those moving through the town. Familiar sounds were reassuring. Unfamiliar ones were noticed, but not immediately alarming. Nighttime sounds were predictable. They followed patterns shaped by daily habit. Someone returning late from work, a household settling in, a distant cart finishing its route. These sounds were not sudden or chaotic. They occurred within expected limits. Security at night was informal but present. Some towns employed night watchmen, while others relied on community awareness. Doors were closed, not out of fear, but as a normal precaution. Barriers were simple. Heavy locks and elaborate systems were uncommon. The idea of total silence did not exist. The city at night was quieter, but never completely still. Stone structures held sound, allowing even small noises to travel. This created a sense of shared space, even when few people were visible. For many, moving through the town at night required confidence built through familiarity. People knew which paths were easiest to follow in low light. They avoided obstacles not by seeing them clearly, but by remembering where they were. Children were rarely out alone after dark. Their presence diminished as evening deepened. Those who remained outside did so with adults moving slowly and staying close. Night encouraged proximity rather than separation. As activity narrowed, the town felt smaller. Fewer open spaces remained accessible. Attention focused on immediate surroundings rather than distant areas. This contraction of space supported a gradual calming of the senses. The absence of spectacle defined the nighttime city. There were no illuminated landmarks drawing the eye. No crowds gathering, no events unfolding. What remained was continuity rather than novelty. People who stayed awake later did so quietly. There was no advantage in staying active once darkness limited what could be done. Night did not offer opportunity. It offered rest, or at least reduced engagement. In this environment, the body responded naturally. Without bright light or constant noise, alertness decreased. Movement slowed not because of instruction, but because stimulation faded. The city itself encouraged rest. The social atmosphere of night was restrained. Encounters were brief and practical, a nod, a short exchange of words. Prolonged conversation was uncommon in public spaces. The tone of interaction matched the environment. Even those who did not intend to sleep immediately felt the influence of night. Activities became smaller in scale. Attention turned inward. The pace of thought softened along with the pace of movement. For many households, the sounds of the city after sunset became part of the background of domestic life. They were heard but not focused on. These sounds confirmed that life continued beyond the walls of the home, even as activity decreased. The city after sunset was not threatening by default. While danger existed, it was not the defining feature of night. Familiarity and routine reduced fear. People knew what to expect, and expectation shaped experience. As evening progressed, fewer people remained outdoors. Those who did were often completing final tasks or returning home. The town gradually emptied, not through force, but through shared habit. This slow withdrawal allowed night to take hold without disruption. The city did not switch off. It dimmed, its functions narrowed, its presence remained, but its demands decreased. In this softened environment, the conditions for rest were already forming. The city itself participated in preparing its inhabitants for sleep simply by becoming quieter, darker, and more predictable. Night in a Roman town was not a dramatic event. It was a collective easing, a shared movement towards stillness that did not require coordination or agreement. As the streets settled into their nighttime state, attention turned increasingly toward the spaces where people would remain until morning. The city continued to exist, but now as a background rather than a stage. In the Roman world, night was defined as much by the absence of light as by its presence. Darkness was not something to eliminate, but something to live within. Artificial light existed, but it was limited, carefully managed, and never intended to turn night into day. Instead, light functioned as a local tool, creating small pockets of visibility within a much larger field of shadow. The most common source of artificial light was the oil lamp. These lamps were simple objects made of clay or metal, designed to burn slowly rather than brightly. They produced a steady, low flame that illuminated only a small area around them. A single lamp could not light an entire room. It created a center of light, leaving the edges in darkness. This contrast shaped how people used space at night. Oil itself was a valuable resource. It required cultivation, processing, and storage. Because of this, lamps were not used casually. They were lit with intention and extinguished as soon as they were no longer necessary. There was no habit of leaving lamps burning continuously throughout the night. Light was used when needed, and darkness was accepted when it was not. Inside homes, lamps were placed strategically. They were often set on low surfaces, shelves, or simple stands. Their position was chosen to support a specific activity, not to illuminate the entire environment. If someone needed to eat, repair an object, or move safely through a space, the lamp was positioned to serve that purpose. Once the task was finished, the lamp might be moved or put out. Fire also played a role in nighttime lighting, but its function was limited. A hearth fire provided warmth more than light, especially as it died down in the evening. Glowing embers offered a soft, uneven illumination that was enough to orient the body without stimulating the senses. And this kind of light did not encourage activity, it encouraged stillness. The quality of Roman lighting was fundamentally different from modern expectations. There was no uniform brightness. Light did not fill space evenly. Instead, it created gradients with brightness near the flame and darkness beyond it. This visual environment reduced detail rather than enhancing it. Shapes became softer. Movement slowed. The eye had less to focus on. Shadows were not considered a problem to solve. They were part of the environment. Walls, furniture, and people cast long, shifting shapes that moved gently as flames flickered. These movements were subtle and familiar. They did not demand attention. Over time, the presence of shadow became normal, even comforting. Because light was limited, people adjusted their behavior. Tasks that required precision were avoided at night. Reading, detailed crafting, or complex preparation were uncommon. Activities shifted toward those that could be done slowly and with minimal visual demand. Conversation, rest, and simple routines fit naturally into this low-light environment. The human body responded to this lighting without conscious effort. Dim light reduced alertness. The absence of bright stimulation allowed the mind to quiet gradually. This effect was not accidental. It was a direct result of how light was used. Nighttime lighting supported the body's natural inclination toward rest rather than working against it. In shared living spaces, a single lamp often served multiple people. This encouraged proximity. People gathered closer together, not necessarily to interact, but because the light created a natural center. The edges of the room faded into darkness, reducing the sense of space and making the environment feel smaller and more contained. This containment had a calming effect. With fewer visible details and less visual depth, the environment offered less information to process. The mind did not need to scan or evaluate its surroundings constantly. This reduction in sensory input supported relaxation. Outside, artificial light was rare. Streets were largely unlit. Any light visible from outside came from private homes, filtering through doorways or small openings. These points of light were scattered and uneven. They did not illuminate paths or define routes. People moving at night relied on memory rather than sight. Moonlight played a role, but it was inconsistent. Its brightness varied with the lunar cycle and weather conditions. On clear nights, it offered some visibility. On cloudy nights, darkness dominated. People accepted this variability. There was no expectation that night should be equally visible every day. The absence of strong outdoor lighting meant that nighttime movement was limited and deliberate. People avoided unnecessary travel. The town did not invite exploration after dark. Instead, it encouraged remaining close to familiar spaces. This reduced both physical activity and mental stimulation. Within homes, the decision to extinguish a lamp was often the final step before rest. Darkness was not something to resist. It signaled that no further activity was expected. Once the lamp was out, the room returned to shadow and attention naturally turned inward. Sleeping spaces were rarely brightly lit before rest. If a lamp was used at all, it was often dimmed or placed at a distance. The goal was orientation, not visibility. People prepared for sleep in low light, allowing their senses to adjust gradually. The flicker of flame, while present, was gentle. It did not flash or pulse dramatically. The movement was slow and repetitive, easily ignored by the eye. Over time, this subtle motion became part of the background, not a point of focus. The contrast between light and dark also shaped the perception of time. Without constant illumination, moments blended together. The absence of visual markers made time feel less segmented. This supported a fluid experience of evening and night, without sharp transitions. In this environment, darkness was not empty. It was filled with familiarity. People knew the layout of their homes and towns well enough to move without full visibility. Darkness did not erase space. It softened it. The Roman night was therefore not defined by what could be seen, but by what no longer needed to be seen. Light was reduced because it was no longer required. This absence allowed rest to emerge naturally. Rather than fighting darkness, Roman lighting practices worked with it. They created just enough visibility to meet basic needs and no more. This balance shaped behavior, mood, and sleep in ways that required no instruction or effort. As lamps were extinguished and fires reduced to embers, the visual world simplified further. Shapes disappeared, boundaries softened. The environment offered fewer signals, fewer demands, and fewer reasons to remain alert. In this softened visual field, the body prepared itself for sleep. Not through force, but through gradual withdrawal. Light faded, activity narrowed, and attention loosened its grip on the external world. Night, illuminated only where necessary, became a space of rest by design rather than intention. The way Romans used light allowed darkness to do its work, guiding the body toward stillness without interruption. In the Roman world, sleep did not take place in a single, standardized kind of room. There was no universal bedroom design and no fixed idea of what a sleeping space should look like. Instead, people slept wherever their homes allowed, adapting available space to the simple need for rest. Sleeping arrangements reflected practicality rather than comfort, as we define it today. Most Roman homes, especially in provincial towns, were organized around shared spaces rather than private rooms. The separation between areas for eating, working, and sleeping was flexible. A space used for daily activity could become a sleeping area at night, then return to its daytime function the next morning. Sleep did not require a dedicated environment. It required only enough space to lie down safely and remain undisturbed. Beds themselves were simple constructions. A basic Roman bed consisted of a wooden frame with woven straps or ropes stretched across it. On top of this surface, bedding was placed to provide minimal cushioning. Mattresses, where they existed, were thin and filled with materials such as straw, wool, or other available fibers. The goal was not softness but separation from the ground. In many households, especially modest ones, sleeping directly on the floor was also common. A mat, blanket, or folded textile could serve as a sleeping surface. This practice was not considered uncomfortable or unusual, it was familiar and sufficient. The body adapted to these surfaces through habit rather than expectation. Social status influenced sleeping arrangements, but not in extreme ways. Wealthier households might have sturdier beds, thicker bedding, or slightly more private spaces. However, even in these homes, sleep was rarely isolated from the rest of the household. Servants, family members, and guests often slept in nearby spaces. Privacy as a concept tied to sleep was limited. Children typically slept near adults, not in separate rooms designed just for them. This proximity was practical and reassuring. Nighttime disturbances were addressed easily when people slept close together. The idea of placing children far from caregivers during the night would have felt unnecessary and impractical. Sleeping positions varied depending on space and custom. People slept on their sides, on their backs, or in positions shaped by available room. There was no prescribed posture for sleep. Bodies found their own rest within the constraints of the environment. Movement during the night was normal and unremarkable. Bedding was minimal but functional. Blankets and coverings provided warmth rather than luxury. Layers could be added or removed depending on temperature. These textiles were often reused throughout the day for other purposes, such as seating or storage. At night, they were gathered and arranged for sleep. Temperature management relied on architecture rather than devices. Thick stone walls retained heat in colder months and stayed cool in warmer ones. Courtyards allowed air circulation. Openings could be adjusted to regulate airflow. These features helped maintain a tolerable sleeping environment without active intervention. Ventilation was especially important. Sleeping spaces were rarely sealed completely. Air moved through doorways, windows, or open roofs. This airflow prevented stagnation and moderated temperature. People accepted the presence of outdoor sounds and air as part of the sleeping environment. Noise during sleep was expected. Complete silence was neither possible nor desired. Sounds from other household members, animals, or the surrounding town were familiar. These sounds did not interrupt sleep unless they were unusual. Familiar noise often made rest easier rather than harder. Lighting during sleep was minimal or non-existent. Once lamps were extinguished, darkness filled the space. There was no expectation of visibility during sleep. Darkness was normal and unproblematic. The absence of light supported rest by removing visual stimulation entirely. The act of preparing a sleeping space was simple and repetitive. Bedding was laid out, positions were chosen, and people settled in. There was no ritualized preparation. These actions required little thought and followed patterns learned over time. Shared sleeping spaces required coordination, but not negotiation. People were accustomed to one another's presence. Movement, breathing, and occasional noise were accepted without comment. The body learned to rest within this shared environment. In some homes, sleeping spaces shifted seasonally. During warmer months, people might sleep closer to open courtyards or near sources of airflow. In colder months, sleeping areas moved inward, closer to retained warmth. This flexibility allowed comfort without altering the structure of the home. The materials used in sleeping spaces reflected availability rather than preference. Wood, wool, straw, and fabric were common. These materials aged with use and carried familiar textures and scents. Over time, they became associated with rest through repetition. Sleep was not framed as an isolated activity. It was one part of the daily cycle integrated with waking life. People did not retreat dramatically from the day to sleep. They transitioned gradually, using the same spaces in quieter ways. For many Romans, sleep was also a communal experience beyond the household. In crowded urban settings, sounds from neighboring homes passed easily through walls. The boundaries between private and public space were thin. Sleep occurred within a network of nearby lives. This closeness did not necessarily reduce rest quality. Familiarity with shared environments allowed people to filter out predictable sounds. The mind did not react strongly to what it recognized as normal. Sleep adapted to context rather than demanding control over it. The physical act of lying down marked the final transition into rest. There were no clocks to indicate when sleep should begin. Fatigue, darkness, and reduced activity guided the body naturally. Sleep arrived when conditions supported it. For some, sleep came quickly. For others, it arrived gradually. Remaining awake for a time was not considered a problem. The night allowed for quiet wakefulness without judgment. Rest did not require immediate unconsciousness. The absence of strict expectations around sleep reduced pressure. There was no belief that sleep needed to follow a particular pattern. Variability was normal. This acceptance made it easier for the body to relax. In this environment, sleeping spaces did not need to be optimized. They needed only to be sufficient. Comfort emerged from familiarity rather than design. The body learned what to expect and adjusted accordingly. Over time, these arrangements created a stable relationship between space and rest. The same walls, surfaces, and textures supported sleep night after night. This consistency reinforced calm rather than novelty. Where Romans slept was less important than how they adapted to their environment. Sleep was shaped by available space, shared presence, and minimal intervention. These conditions allowed rest to emerge naturally, without instruction or effort. As night deepened, sleeping spaces became quieter not because they were isolated, but because activity elsewhere diminished. The town itself supported sleep by narrowing its movement and sound. In this way, Roman sleeping arrangements reflected the broader rhythm of life. They were simple, flexible, and sufficient. Sleep did not require perfection. It required only the conditions to settle. Sleep for Romans was shaped less by comfort as an ideal and more by comfort as a condition that emerged naturally over time. The body adapted to its surroundings rather than expecting the surroundings to adapt to it. What mattered most was familiarity. The repeated experience of resting in the same way in the same place allowed the body to relax without effort. There was no expectation that sleep should feel perfect. Mild discomfort was normal and did not prevent rest. People did not analyze how they slept or search for optimal conditions. They accepted the environment as it was and allowed the body to adjust gradually. This acceptance reduced mental activity and made rest easier. Sleeping positions were chosen instinctively rather than deliberately. People shifted during the night as needed, responding to pressure, temperature, and sensation. Movement was not restricted, and waking briefly to change position was common and unremarkable. The body's needs guided these adjustments without conscious planning. The surfaces on which people slept influenced posture naturally. Firmer surfaces encouraged the body to distribute weight differently than soft ones. Over time, muscles and joints adapted. The body learned how to rest efficiently within these constraints, reducing strain and discomfort through habit. Temperature played a central role in shaping sleep quality. Roman homes did not maintain a constant internal temperature. Instead, they followed the rhythms of the external environment. This variability was expected and accounted for through clothing, bedding, and sleeping location. In cooler periods, additional layers were used. Blankets, cloaks, or spare garments provided insulation. People slept closer together, sharing warmth. Body heat became an important resource distributed naturally through proximity rather than design. In warmer seasons, the approach was different. Bedding was lighter and sleeping positions changed to allow airflow. People slept nearer to open courtyards, doorways, or windows. The goal was not to cool the body aggressively, but to allow heat to dissipate gradually. Air movement was valued more than temperature control. A slight breeze was often enough to make sleep comfortable. The architecture of Roman homes supported this by allowing air to circulate freely. This airflow prevented the buildup of heat and supported steady breathing during sleep. Humidity and dryness were also factors. Stone and plaster walls moderated moisture levels naturally. Floors absorbed some humidity, while open spaces prevented stagnation. These subtle environmental effects supported physical comfort without active management. Clothing worn during sleep varied. Some people slept in simple garments, while others removed clothing depending on temperature and habit. There was no fixed standard. What mattered was ease of movement and thermal comfort. Clothing adjusted naturally to conditions rather than following custom. The body's relationship with temperature during sleep was dynamic. As the night progressed, temperatures often dropped. People responded by pulling coverings closer or shifting position. These adjustments happened half-consciously, without fully waking. Breathing patterns during sleep reflected the calm environment. Without artificial noise or stimulation, breathing slowed naturally. The body entered a steady rhythm that supported deeper rest. This process did not require intention or technique. Physical fatigue accumulated gradually during the day and played a major role in sleep onset. Work, movement, and daily activity prepared the body for rest. Sleep was not something to be forced. It arrived when the body was ready. The absence of evening stimulation made it easier for the body to transition. Without bright light or constant activity, the nervous system naturally reduced alertness. This supported the body's ability to relax fully once lying down. Pain and minor discomfort were part of life, but they were not framed as obstacles to sleep. People learned to rest alongside these sensations. Over time, the body developed tolerance and adjustment strategies that reduced their impact during sleep. The predictability of the sleeping environment played a key role. Familiar textures, smells, and sounds signaled safety. This sense of stability allowed the body to release tension and enter rest more easily. Touch and proximity influenced comfort as well. Sharing a sleeping space meant that warmth, movement, and presence were felt. These sensations were familiar and reassuring. They reduced feelings of isolation and supported relaxation. Sleep did not require stillness. Minor movements from others were expected and filtered out by the mind. The body learned to remain at rest despite external motion, as long as it remained predictable. The body's internal clock was guided by light rather than timekeeping. Darkness signaled rest, while gradual changes in light influenced sleep depth. Without artificial interruption, sleep followed a more organic pattern. This often resulted in lighter sleep during certain periods of the night and deeper sleep during others. These fluctuations were natural and accepted. There was no expectation of uniform sleep quality throughout the night. Dreams, when they occurred, were treated as a normal part of rest rather than something to interpret or control. They did not influence how sleep was approached. Rest remained the primary goal, not mental experience. The body's recovery during sleep was gradual. Muscles relaxed, breathing deepened, and movement decreased. These changes occurred over time, supported by the calm environment. Sleep was not expected to restore energy completely in a single night. Daily life accounted for variability. Some days began with more fatigue than others, and this was normal. The cycle adjusted over time. Temperature changes during the night sometimes caused brief awakenings. These were not disruptive. The body responded, adjusted, and returned to rest without concern. Wakefulness and sleep coexisted naturally. The physical experience of sleep was shaped by repetition rather than innovation. Each night reinforced familiarity. This repetition reduced awareness and supported deeper rest. There was no effort to control sleep posture or duration. The body moved toward equilibrium on its own. This lack of control reduced mental engagement and supported calm. Morning light eventually influenced body temperature and alertness. As the environment changed, the body responded gradually. Sleep lightened naturally without abrupt interruption. In this way, the body's rest was fully integrated into the natural cycle of the day and night. Comfort was not engineered. It emerged from adaptation, familiarity, and acceptance. The Roman approach to bodily rest was quiet and unexamined. Sleep did not require explanation or optimization. It was a continuation of the body's daily rhythm, supported by simple conditions and repeated experience. This relationship between body, environment, and rest created a stable foundation for sleep. It did not eliminate discomfort or variation, but it reduced resistance. The body rested because it was allowed to, not because it was directed to. As night continued, the body remained supported by its surroundings. Temperature, position, and sensation settled into balance. Sleep deepened not through effort, but through the absence of disturbance. Sleep in the Roman world was rarely a single, uninterrupted stretch from nightfall to morning. Instead, it unfolded in phases. Waking during the night was normal, expected, and largely unremarkable. These awakenings were not treated as disruptions, but as part of the natural rhythm of rest. Without artificial lighting or timekeeping, people did not experience the night as a continuous block of unconsciousness. The body moved gradually between deeper and lighter states of rest. Moments of wakefulness emerged naturally, guided by internal rhythms rather than external demands. When people woke during the night, they did not immediately associate wakefulness with anxiety or failure to sleep. There was no pressure to remain asleep. Being awake in the darkness was simply another state the body passed through before returning to rest. The environment supported this calm acceptance. Darkness remained constant. There were no glowing clocks or illuminated screens to draw attention. Without visual stimulation, wakefulness felt different. It was quieter, slower, and less demanding. Sound during the night was minimal and predictable. A distant animal, a shifting body nearby, or the subtle creak of materials settling were familiar signals. These sounds did not prompt alertness. They confirmed continuity rather than change. During these waking moments, people often remained still. There was no expectation to get up or engage in activity. The body rested even when the mind was briefly awake. This stillness made it easier to return to sleep. Thoughts during nighttime wakefulness were typically slow and unfocused. Without stimulation, the mind did not race. Reflections, if they occurred, drifted gently without direction. The absence of urgency allowed awareness to fade naturally. In some cases, people used these waking periods for simple, quiet actions, adjusting bedding, changing position, taking a sip of water. These movements were deliberate but minimal. They did not signal the start of a new phase of activity. Occasionally, individuals stepped outside briefly during the night. This was done quietly and with familiarity. Night air was cool and still. Such moments were short and practical, not restless or aimless. There was no cultural expectation that the night belonged entirely to sleep. The idea that waking should be resisted or corrected did not exist. Wakefulness was not a problem to solve. It was a condition that passed. This acceptance reduced mental tension. Without worry about sleep quality or duration, the body remained relaxed even when awake. This relaxation supported a smooth return to sleep. Nighttime wakefulness often coincided with shifts in temperature. As the air cooled, the body adjusted. Brief waking allowed people to pull coverings closer or reposition themselves. These responses happened naturally without frustration. The presence of others in shared sleeping spaces influenced these moments. Familiar breathing, movement, and warmth were reassuring. They reminded the waking individual that rest continued around them. Silence during the night was never complete. Instead, it was layered and soft. The mind learned to rest within this soundscape. Wakefulness did not heighten awareness. It softened it. In the absence of artificial timekeeping, people did not know how long they were awake. Minutes and hours were not measured. This lack of measurement prevented impatience. Wakefulness did not feel extended because it was not tracked. Some historians describe this pattern as segmented sleep, but for those living it, there was no concept to name it. It was simply how nights unfolded. Sleep came, receded, and returned without explanation. The body's internal rhythms guided these transitions. Hormonal cycles, temperature changes, and fatigue levels worked together. Without interference, these processes regulated themselves smoothly. Dreaming often occurred between waking phases. Dreams faded gently into awareness, then dissolved. There was no effort to interpret or remember them. They were allowed to pass. The darkness of night supported this fluid experience. Without visual anchors, the mind did not fixate. Awareness floated rather than focused. This state made it easier to drift back into sleep. Children experienced nighttime waking similarly. They stirred, adjusted, and returned to rest. There was no expectation that they remain fully asleep through the night. Their rhythms were accepted as part of growth and development. Older individuals also experienced more frequent waking. This was not seen as a problem. Age-related changes were integrated into daily life without concern. Rest adjusted naturally over time. The absence of nighttime obligations allowed waking moments to remain calm. There were no alarms to anticipate, no schedules pressing forward. The night belonged entirely to rest, even when sleep paused. In this environment, the boundary between sleeping and waking was soft. People moved between states without abrupt change. This softness reduced stress on the nervous system. Occasional sounds from the town reinforced this continuity. A distant movement or familiar noise reminded listeners that life continued quietly beyond the household. These sounds did not disturb, they grounded. If wakefulness extended longer than expected, people remained at ease. Lying quietly was still considered rest. Sleep did not need to be forced. It would return when the body was ready. The body learned to trust this process. Over time, confidence in sleep reduced the need to control it. This trust made rest more resilient. As the night progressed, deeper sleep often followed later waking phases. The body settled fully once adjustments were complete. Rest intensified naturally toward the later part of the night. Morning approached gradually. Light softened darkness before it became visible. The body sensed this change subtly, preparing for eventual waking. Nighttime waking did not interfere with the coming day. The rhythm balanced itself over time. Variability was expected and absorbed into routine. In this way, interrupted sleep was not fragmented or deficient. It was adaptive. It aligned with natural cycles rather than resisting them. The Roman experience of night allowed both sleep and awareness to coexist peacefully. Neither state dominated, each flowed into the other without conflict. This quiet flexibility made rest sustainable. Sleep did not depend on strict conditions, it depended on allowing the body to move naturally through its rhythms. As the night continued, waking moments grew less frequent. The body found its balance, awareness softened, sleep resumed. The night carried the sleeper gently forward, not by force, but by patience. Rest unfolded slowly, supported by darkness, familiarity, and acceptance. This gentle return to sleep did not mean the night was entirely without awareness. Even as rest settled back in, there remained a thin layer of caution that belonged to darkness itself. It was not constant fear, and it was not something people stayed focused on, but rather a background understanding that the world felt different when visibility dropped and the town grew still. In a Roman town, safety at night was not guaranteed by modern systems. There were no bright streets, no cameras, no emergency services waiting to respond. And yet most nights were not chaotic or dangerous, they were ordinary. The town had routines that reduced risk, and people lived inside those routines until they felt natural. Night did not become safe because danger was impossible. It became manageable because most threats were predictable, and most behavior was designed to avoid unnecessary exposure. One of the simplest forms of protection was distance. As night deepened, movement narrowed. People stayed closer to home, closer to familiar doors, familiar neighbors, and known paths. Travel after dark was not romantic or adventurous. It was inconvenient. The streets were harder to read. The edges of buildings disappeared into shadow, and small obstacles became more serious. Avoiding movement was not an act of fear. It was an act of efficiency, and efficiency often looks like caution. Homes were also designed to create basic separation between the household and the street. Even modest dwellings had doors, shutters, curtains, or internal partitions that could be adjusted as evening progressed. The purpose of these barriers was not to create silence or isolation, it was to create a boundary. A door did not need to be unbreakable to be meaningful. It only needed to slow entry, define inside and outside, and signal that a space was no longer open. As daylight faded, households began closing themselves gently, the way the town itself softened. Openings that had been wide during the day were narrowed. Curtains or coverings were adjusted. Tools were brought inside. Objects that might be left outside during daylight were moved closer to the home. These changes were not dramatic preparations for danger. They were a quiet habit, repeated so often that it required little thought. Habit is one of the strongest forms of safety because it does not require constant vigilance. Locks existed, but they were not standardized or universally strong. Some doors were secured with wooden bars, bolts, or simple metal fittings. Others relied more on the strength of the door itself and the fact that most people respected boundaries most of the time. Security in Roman towns often depended less on the hardware and more on the social fabric. A town of familiar faces created a sense of recognition. Strangers were noticed. Unusual movement stood out. This awareness acted as a quiet deterrent without needing confrontation. In some places there were forms of organized nighttime presence. Certain towns had watchmen, guards, or patrol-like roles, especially where public order mattered. But even when such roles existed, the night was not controlled in the way modern cities are. There was no continuous surveillance. Safety was patchy, local, and built out of shared expectation. People lived with that reality without constantly thinking about it, because constant thinking would have been exhausting and unnecessary. Fear itself, when it appeared, was usually specific rather than vague. It was not an abstract dread of night. It was concern about particular risks, fire, theft, injury, or the possibility of someone entering a home. These worries rose and fell depending on context. They were more present in certain neighborhoods, more present after certain events, and less present on ordinary, predictable nights. The key difference from modern anxiety is that these fears were not fed by constant information. They were fed only by what happened locally and what people had actually experienced. Among all nighttime risks, fire was one of the most practical and persistent concerns. Roman life relied on flame. Lamps, hearths, ovens, and braziers were essential tools, but they carried risk. A small flame could become an accident if it tipped, if a wick flared, if a surface caught, or if an ember rolled into something dry. Fires did not need to be frequent to be taken seriously. The possibility alone was enough to shape careful behavior. This is one reason lamps were used sparingly and handled with restraint. People trimmed wicks, controlled flame size, and placed lamps in stable locations. Fire was not treated casually because it was not merely a convenience. It was power. It created light and warmth, but it could also destroy a household quickly. Many homes were built with materials that could burn, and even stone structures contained wooden beams, textiles, and stored goods. Fire was both friend and threat, and that duality shaped the night. Nighttime often involved letting fires settle rather than keeping them strong. A hearth might be reduced to embers, a lamp might be extinguished earlier than desired. These choices were not only about conserving fuel, though that mattered. They were also about keeping the night calm and lowering risk. A quieter flame meant a quieter household. It meant less smoke, less movement, and fewer reasons for attention to remain active. The fear of intruders existed, but it rarely dominated the night. Most people were not lying awake imagining danger at every sound. Instead, they listened with familiarity. A predictable noise did not become fear. It became background. A door creak, a neighbor shifting, an animal moving nearby. These were normal. Fear rose only when something was unfamiliar, an unusual rhythm of footsteps, a sound in the wrong place, a sudden disturbance where none was expected. Dogs played an important role in this nighttime environment. Even without formal security systems, households and neighborhoods often had dogs that barked when something unfamiliar approached. The bark was not a constant alarm, it was a signal that something had changed. Most barking was brief, and people learned to distinguish between a normal response and a more intense disturbance. Dogs did not eliminate risk, they reduced surprise, and reducing surprise is one of the simplest ways to reduce fear. Within a household, sleeping in shared spaces also provided a form of protection, not because people were guarding one another consciously, but because multiple bodies meant multiple senses. If someone noticed something, others could wake quickly. If a child stirred, an adult would hear. If a noise came from outside, it would be heard by more than one person. This shared presence created stability. It made the night feel less solitary and therefore less threatening. The architecture of Roman towns also contributed to a certain kind of protection. Narrow streets, clustered homes, and familiar pathways created a sense of enclosure. An outsider moving through such spaces stood out more easily, not because they were visible, but because their movement did not match the expected pattern. Towns were networks of habit. Habit is a subtle form of security. Even so, safety was never absolute. People lived with the knowledge that night could include accidents, illness, conflict, or unexpected events, but the key is that they did not treat these possibilities as constant mental companions. They prepared quietly through routine and then allowed the mind to soften. Night was not a time for constant scanning. It was a time when the body needed rest, and rest required letting go. This balance between practical caution and emotional calm was one of the defining features of nighttime life. People closed doors, lowered flames, stayed close to home, and listened when necessary. Then they returned to sleep. Fear did not need to vanish entirely for sleep to happen. It only needed to remain in the background, kept small by familiarity and habit. And so the Roman night was not fearless, but it was not dominated by fear either. It was a world where safety was relative and accepted, where caution existed without urgency, and where the town itself helped reduce risk simply by becoming quieter, darker, and more predictable. In that predictability, the body could rest again, even knowing that the night remained the night. This quiet acceptance of the night shaped how everyone rested, but it did not shape everyone in the same way. Within the shared calm of Roman nighttime life, children and older adults experienced sleep differently. not because the night changed for them, but because their bodies moved through it on different rhythms. These differences were not treated as problems to solve. They were expected, familiar, and absorbed naturally into household life. Children in Roman towns did not follow carefully managed sleep schedules. There was no concept of a fixed bedtime designed around age or developmental stage. Instead, children remained close to the rhythm of the household. As evening activity softened and light faded, they settled naturally alongside adults. Sleep came when fatigue arrived, not when a rule demanded it. This closeness created continuity rather than separation. Very young children often fell asleep early, carried by the gradual quiet of the evening. Others remained awake longer, resting nearby while adults finished small tasks. There was no sharp line between being awake and being asleep. A child might drift in and out, listening to familiar sounds, feeling the presence of others, and eventually settling fully into rest. This drifting was not interrupted or corrected. It was allowed to happen. Because families slept in shared spaces, children were rarely isolated during the night. They slept within reach, within sound, and often within touch. This proximity reduced anxiety without needing explanation. A child waking briefly in the darkness was not alone in a silent room. They were surrounded by breathing, warmth, and the subtle movement of familiar bodies. This environment made wakefulness less startling and sleep easier to return to. Nighttime waking among children was common and unremarkable. A child might stir, change position, or speak softly before falling asleep again. These moments were not framed as disruptions. Adults responded minimally, offering reassurance through presence rather than intervention. There was no expectation that children should remain asleep continuously. The night allowed for movement and adjustment. As children grew older, their sleep patterns shifted gradually rather than suddenly. Some began staying awake longer into the evening, observing adult routines in low light. Others woke earlier in the morning, responding quickly to changes in light and sound. These shifts happened organically, guided by the body rather than instruction. Sleep adjusted as life adjusted. Older adults experienced the night differently as well. Age brought changes in sleep depth, duration, and timing, just as it does now. Older Romans often slept more lightly and woke more frequently during the night. These awakenings were not viewed as failures of rest. They were accepted as part of aging, woven into the household's shared rhythm. For older individuals, nighttime wakefulness could include quiet observation, sitting briefly, adjusting position, or listening to the town's distant sounds. These moments were calm rather than restless. Without pressure to sleep a certain number of hours, wakefulness did not turn into frustration. Rest was measured by the absence of strain, not by unconsciousness alone. In many households, older adults naturally became part of the night's quiet awareness. Their lighter sleep meant they noticed small changes, a sound outside, a shift in temperature, a disturbance within the household. This awareness did not create constant vigilance. It existed gently, without effort. In this way, age contributed to household stability without formal responsibility. Children and older adults often shared sleeping spaces with others whose sleep was deeper. This mixture of rhythms created balance. Some bodies rested heavily, while others remained lightly aware. The household as a whole remained stable, even though individual experiences differed. No one needed to adjust themselves to match another's sleep pattern. The environment allowed variety. The absence of strict expectations around sleep protected both children and the elderly from unnecessary stress. There was no idea that a child who woke at night was misbehaving, or that an older person who slept lightly was deficient. Sleep was understood as variable by nature. This understanding reduced emotional strain and supported calmer nights. Care during the night was subtle and integrated. If a child was unwell or if an older person needed assistance, Help came quietly and without drama. The shared sleeping environment made this easier. Care did not require full waking or strong light. It happened in the same low-stimulation atmosphere as the rest of the night. This closeness also meant that illness or discomfort was noticed early. A change in breathing, restlessness, or movement stood out against the quiet background. Response was immediate but restrained. There was no rush to fully wake the household unless necessary. Calm was preserved whenever possible. Children learned from this environment without being taught. They learned that waking was not dangerous, that darkness was not hostile, and that rest could return naturally. These lessons were absorbed through experience rather than explanation. Over time, the night became familiar rather than mysterious. Older adults, having lived through many such nights, carried deep familiarity with this rhythm. They knew that sleep changed across a lifetime. They knew that waking did not mean the night was broken. This quiet knowledge shaped the household's attitude toward rest, reinforcing acceptance rather than control. The presence of multiple generations in shared spaces softened the night's emotional tone. Youth brought movement and unpredictability. Age brought stillness and awareness. Together they created a balanced environment where no single rhythm dominated. The night adapted to the household rather than the household adapting to an ideal night. Even fears discussed earlier of fire, intrusion, or unexpected events were filtered through this shared experience. Children were protected not through explanation, but through routine. Older adults were reassured not through security, but through familiarity. The night held everyone in the same conditions, allowing each to respond in their own way. As the night progressed, differences in sleep became less pronounced. Deeper rest returned for many, including those who had woken earlier. The household settled again, supported by the same predictability that had guided the evening. Variation did not disrupt continuity. It existed within it. Toward the later part of the night, children often slept more deeply, their bodies recovering from the day's movement. Older adults might remain in lighter rest, sensing the earliest signs of morning. This gentle distribution of awareness required no coordination. It happened naturally, shaped by age and habit. In this way, the Roman night accommodated all stages of life without modification. There were no separate arrangements designed specifically for children or the elderly. The same environment served everyone precisely because it was flexible and undemanding. The night did not impose a single pattern. It allowed many to coexist. This shared acceptance reduced tension around sleep across generations. Rest was not something to be enforced, corrected, or measured. It was something that happened differently for each person, within the same calm frame. As darkness continued to hold the town, children and older adults rested in their own ways, supported by familiarity rather than structure. The night remained predictable, quiet, and sufficient. And within that sufficiency, each body found the rest it needed, without needing the night to be anything other than what it already was. The same flexibility that allowed so many different bodies to rest within the night also shaped how the night released its hold. Morning in a Roman town did not arrive as a command or a signal. It emerged gently, following the same quiet logic that had guided the evening and the night before it. Just as rest had not been enforced, waking was not demanded. The night did not end abruptly. It loosened its grip slowly. Long before daylight became visible, subtle changes began to take place. Darkness did not disappear all at once. It softened. The deepest black of the night gave way to a faint, almost imperceptible lightening of the sky. This change was not something people consciously watched for. It was something the body sensed without effort. Awareness began to shift before the eyes noticed anything different. Air temperature often changed first. The coldest part of the night passed quietly, and the slightest warmth returned to the air. Breathing felt marginally easier. Muscles adjusted. Even those still deeply asleep responded to these changes without waking fully. The environment prepared the body for transition without disturbance. Sound returned in layers, just as it had faded in layers the night before. The town did not wake all at once. Instead, isolated sounds appeared and then dissolved back into quiet. A bird calling briefly. A distant movement, the faint sound of someone stirring within a nearby household. These sounds did not announce morning. They suggested it, gently and without urgency. Within homes, people stirred at different times. Some woke briefly and returned to sleep. Others lingered in a half-aware state, resting without fully rising. There was no shared moment of waking. Each body followed its own rhythm, guided by light, habit, and readiness rather than expectation. Children often remained asleep longer, their rest deepened by the later hours of the night. Older adults were more likely to wake earlier, lying quietly as awareness returned. These differences did not require coordination. They existed comfortably within the same space, just as they had throughout the night. Light entered homes unevenly. In houses with open courtyards, the sky above slowly brightened, allowing soft illumination to reach surrounding rooms. In narrower dwellings, light filtered in through doorways or small openings, changing the color of shadow rather than eliminating it. No room became bright quickly. Morning revealed itself gradually. The act of waking was not immediate movement. People often remained still for some time, allowing the body to adjust. Stretching happened slowly. Breathing deepened. The transition from rest to activity was unmarked and unhurried. There was no need to hurry toward the day. The absence of alarms preserved this gentleness. No sound forced the body into alertness. Waking occurred when rest had reached its natural conclusion, not when an external signal demanded it. This allowed the nervous system to remain calm, even as consciousness returned. As individuals rose, they did so quietly. Movement was careful, not out of fear of waking others, but because the body had not yet shifted fully into daytime energy. Bedding was adjusted or gathered. Sleeping spaces were restored to their daytime function with minimal effort. Morning washing was practical and brief. Water was used sparingly. Hands and faces were refreshed rather than cleaned thoroughly. These small actions helped the body complete its transition into wakefulness without creating stimulation. Clothing was familiar and required little thought. Garments were put on slowly, following the same pattern each day. Dressing was not a separate event, but a continuation of waking. There was no choice to make, no decision to weigh. Food did not always appear immediately. Some people ate early, taking small amounts of bread or leftovers. Others waited until later, allowing hunger to develop naturally. Morning eating was light and functional when it occurred, supporting the body without weighing it down. Outside, the town began to change in appearance. Doors opened partway, shutters were adjusted to admit air and light. These actions happened independently across the town, without coordination, yet together they reshaped the environment. The town did not wake as a unit. It woke in waves. Sounds increased gradually. Footsteps became more frequent. Quiet voices carried across stone surfaces. The movement of carts and animals resumed slowly. None of these sounds dominated. They layered gently, forming the background of the new day. The early morning retained a softness that set it apart from later hours. Activity was present, but energy remained measured. People moved with purpose, but not urgency. The body had not yet reached full momentum, and the day respected that. Work did not begin at a fixed hour. Tasks resumed when conditions felt right. Light, temperature, and readiness guided action. This flexibility reduced tension and preserved continuity between night and day. The morning did not erase the night, it grew out of it. Children rejoined the household's activity as they woke, remaining close as the day began. Their presence did not disrupt the rhythm. They followed the same gradual transition, shaped by observation rather than instruction. Older adults often remained quietly active, moving at a pace that matched their energy. Morning offered them space to begin the day without pressure. Their earlier waking did not separate them from the household. It simply placed them slightly ahead in the cycle. As light strengthened, shadows shifted and shortened. Details that had been hidden during the night reappeared slowly. The town became visible again, not all at once, but piece by piece. Familiar structures regained definition without surprising the senses. Despite this increase in visibility and movement, mornings remained calm. The intensity of the day had not yet arrived. The environment allowed people to enter activity gently, without shock. This gentleness shaped how the entire day unfolded. The memory of the night faded without reflection. People did not analyze how they had slept or how often they had woken. The night did not require evaluation. It had done its work simply by passing as it always did. In this way, the Roman night ended not with a boundary, but with a transformation. Darkness did not stop. It thinned. Rest did not break. It softened into waking. The cycle continued without interruption. Morning did not stand apart from the night as a separate experience. It was its natural continuation. The same spaces, the same sounds, now seen and heard differently. Nothing needed to change suddenly for the day to begin. This quiet ending of the night protected the calm that sleep had created. There was no jolt, no demand, no urgency. Awareness returned gently, carried by light, temperature, and habit. And just as the night had allowed many rhythms to coexist, the morning respected them as well. Some bodies moved sooner, others later. The day accommodated this difference without friction. As the town fully entered daylight, the night released its final hold. Rest had been given, balance had been restored. The cycle was complete, ready to begin again without effort. Nothing was concluded deliberately. The night did not announce its end. It simply became something else. And in that quiet transformation, the rhythm of life continued, steady and unremarkable, exactly as it always had. And so this ordinary night does not need a conclusion in the usual sense. There is nothing here to summarize, nothing to carry forward deliberately. The details of this world can remain exactly where they are, settled into their own quiet rhythm. The Roman night did not ask for understanding or attention. It existed night after night, doing its work without comment. Bodies rested, woke, adjusted, and rested again, supported not by precision or control, but by familiarity and acceptance. You do not need to remember how it unfolded. You do not need to hold on to any part of it. The rhythm can continue on its own, just as it always did, without effort and without instruction. If your thoughts drift, that is natural. If sleep arrives, it can arrive gently. There is nothing left to do and nowhere to go. The night is sufficient as it is. Good night.